What do you need for a walk in the desert? I have lived in Australia. I know for certain one thing you need water. You also need bread. Welcome to another tidbit from the Bible. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen. We are reflecting on the text from the second book in the Bible, from the book of Exodus. And we have arrived at chapters 16 and 17. This is where Israel, after the victory at the Red Sea, after having walked through the Red Sea dry feet, they are continuing their wandering in the desert, and they are moving in these chapters from the Red Sea to Mount Sinai. This is the first real wandering in the desert, and the events that take place reflect a pattern that you will see repeated again and again as 40 years will pass. Let's read from chapter 15, verse 22, because that's really where this real walk in wandering in the desert takes its beginning. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. And I'm reading from the New International Version. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That's why the place is called Marah, which means bitter. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" And that little wonderful word, grumble, complain, in Hebrew, lun, becomes a key word in the wandering in the wilderness. It's repeated again and again in these chapters, and later on in the book of Numbers. They grumbled, they complained, they murmured. You have different ways of trying to express the sentiments that are hidden in the word. They grumbled. Then Moses cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. That is, it became healthy. So, that is settled. When you walk in the desert, you need water. The interesting thing is that if you look at chapters 16 and 17, you have in the middle how God cared for them by giving them bread, and then it is framed by two events where they need water. When they come to Rephidim, which is told in the first part of chapter 17. So, in the middle, God takes care of them by giving them bread. Then you have two events where they lack water. And if you move further from that center in chapter 16, you will see how God was victorious over the Egyptians. And then you have in the end of chapter 17 how God was victorious over the people of Amalek. And the Amalekites are seen here and in other parts of Scripture as an arch enemy of God's people. You have Egypt, then you have the nomadic people of Amalek. They are exploiting the weakness of the Israelite people as they walk through the desert, and they attack and try to kill them from the very beginning. And they remain such an enemy as we move on in Scripture. Samuel has to kill its last major king, Agag, and it may be that the enemy of Mordecai and Esther and the Jews in the book of Esther, who is Haman, is a descendant. He is at least called an Agagite, so he is also belonging to this arch enemy. So Egypt on one side is beaten up, Amalek is overcome on the other side. You move inwards, you have two stories about the need for water, and the middle in chapter 16. you have the narrative, the miracle, told about how the people receives bread from God. Let me, before we move to that, notice that in chapter 15, when they came the first time at Marah, and when they get healthy water, Moses begins teaching the people about the laws of God. The justice, mishpat, that is the way of conducting justice in a society, that takes its beginning, and there is a solemn promise. If the people of God will listen to him and follow his advice, his commands, his regulations, then he will bless them. And the plagues that hit the Egyptians, the sicknesses, will not hit the people. God is their healer. The great healer, in the end, Jesus Christ himself. And then, in the middle, chapter 16. Now, there are many ways of having a perspective on a narrative. One is, of course, geographical. And that's important also in the book of Exodus. The people have moved from Egypt, now from the Red Sea, towards Sinai, and from chapter 18 and onwards in the book, Sinai is a geographical center. This is where they, in these chapters 16 and 17, where they are on the move. Another perspective is to look at who is talking. How do the various characters of the narrative pop up? What do they do? And interestingly enough, in chapter 16, you have a lot of talking. People speak to each other. The first example, verse 2 in chapter 16. In the desert, the whole community grumbled. You got it. The Hebrew word lun. They murmured, they complained. They grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. There is an irony as they were standing with the Red Sea in front of them and the army of the Pharaoh behind them. The people said, it would have been better for us to die in Egypt than be brought out here, or be slaves in Egypt, than to be brought out here to die in the desert. And then God saves them. The irony is, of course, that this particular generation who is grumbling all the time, they actually end up dying in the desert. But in the text in chapter 16 in Exodus, this is the beginning of a series of talks, minor talks, you could say. You have 14 altogether, and they go together 7 and 7. And the first 7 are structured like a reverse parallel. A sandwich, at least a good Danish sandwich, or like what is called a chiasm, named from the Greek letter chi. So you have 3 pairs on in each side, and in the middle you have a particular sentence. First, in verse 3, as we read, the people speak. Then the Lord speaks to Moses. Moses and Aaron speak. Moses speaks. Then Moses speaks to Aaron. And we are back to the Lord speaks, or Yahweh speaks to Moses. And then in the end of this cycle of 7, the people speak again. In the middle, Moses speaks, and we are going to read from verse 8 what he actually says. Moses also said, you will know, he's speaking to the Israelites, that it was the Lord. You will know it was the Lord. That's an important sentence throughout Exodus. When he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? Referring to Moses and Aaron. You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord. And that's extremely important. It's a major lesson when the people of Israel were grumbling against Moses and Aaron, they were grumbling against God. And that is what he tells them. Now, the next cycle of 7 small speeches, that is verbal addresses mentioned in the chapter, are different from the first 7. The next 7 are actually structured along the line of 3 parallels. And there are 3 sentences, which actually is the same sentence, that somehow form the core. In verse 16, this is what the Lord has commanded. It has all to do with the manna from heaven that came down, which God gave them. This is what the Lord has commanded. A similar sentence you find in verse 23. This is what the Lord commanded. And finally, in verse 32, Moses said, this is what the Lord has commanded. So here you have 3 parallels. This is what the Lord has commanded. They are all these commands from the Lord, followed by an explanation by Moses. But the middle one has an extra that makes it 7. 2, 2, 2, but in the middle there is an extra. And that extra is a speech by the Lord himself. So we're going to read from this extra, which makes it significant. In verse 28, then the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. It's quite interesting. What do you need when you walk in the desert? You need water, and you have 2 narrative events about the water. Framing what you also need, you need bread. Bread from heaven, manna. But you need more than that. You need trust in the Lord. You need to stop from your work. You need to stop from collecting manna. So God created and gave them the Sabbath, where there was no manna. They got a double portion on the 6th day of the week, so that they could celebrate the Sabbath. You need more than bread and water. You need a personal relationship to God. As we read from verse 23, this is underlined this way. This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. The point was that some Israelites didn't understand it. They were double portion on Friday, but they still went out Sabbath morning. They shouldn't do that. This was a day where you are not supposed to do menial work. This is a day of, as a feast, you are to celebrate. This is called here a day of rest. In Hebrew, Shabbaton, which becomes a Sabbatismos in Hebrews with the promise there is still a day of rest. This is a day of faith. God will provide water and bread, yes, but he provides with something more. He provides you with a day of celebration where you stop working, you relax in faith, and you enjoy the fellowship with God. So in the midst of this wandering, there is the Sabbath. And it's worth underlining that this is before the 10 Commandments. It's before God spoke the Sabbath commandment from Mount Sinai, where he, by the way, of course, indicated that the Sabbath goes back to creation. But the Sabbath was an institution for the Jews and for the world already before they arrived at Sinai. Thank you for listening to this tidbit from Exodus, and welcome back as we continue our reflections on this book, second book of the Bible, and as we move to Mount Sinai.